Somewhere in the shadows of Virginia's tobacco fields lies a secret the county once buried, a ledger listing 40 names, 40 failed marriages, all written in ink and shame. But the truth is far darker than any ledger can reveal. By November of 1847, one name appeared last, trembling on the page: Margaret Langford, transferred to quarters. That line was not a record of marriage. It was a prelude to destruction, a quiet declaration that something unthinkable had been decided. Margaret Langford, the only surviving child of Colonel Thaddius Langford, had been the promise of a legacy, yet society had rejected her. Not for lack of wealth, not for lack of intelligence, but for a body deemed grotesque in a world obsessed with appearances. At 23, she was enormous by the standards of polite society, a woman whose size had become her sentence. Men avoided her. Families whispered, conspiracies of polite cruelty spreading through drawing rooms like a slow poison. 40 suitors came and went. 40 hearts, unwilling to carry what her father carried as a burden of pride. Thaddius Langford was a man forged by war, his body scarred and his eyes hollowed by the blood he had seen. Yet nothing had prepared him for this battlefield, a society that saw his daughter as a commodity, and him as a man whose debts could only be paid with her submission. Virginia in 1847 was not a land of mercy. It was a chessboard of survival, and Margaret's worth was measured in ledgers, in pounds of tobacco, in the absence of suitors. The plantation itself had become a cathedral of dread. The oaks that once welcomed visitors now towered as sentinels, their branches scraping carriages like skeletal fingers. The Georgian manor reflected the sun in windows like vacant eyes, watching, judging, witnessing the decay of love and dignity under its roof. Inside, Margaret moved quietly through halls heavy with the scent of tobacco and despair, a gentle soul trapped within the walls of her father's pride and society's cruelty. But there was a plan, a cold, deliberate solution that would shock the conscience of anyone who believes that family protects rather than exploits. That plan was written not in the ledger, not in whispers, but in the unflinching gaze of a father who had seen war, debt, and death and decided that his daughter's life could be sacrificed to preserve his own name. Margaret Langford's fate, like the deepest secrets of human corruption, was about to be rewritten in ways that no one, not even she, could imagine. The question is simple, but its answer will change the way you see power, society, and loyalty. How far can a man go to preserve his legacy, and what becomes of the innocent he uses as a shield? Tonight, we will walk down the path no historian dares to follow. We will see what happens when wealth, pride, and desire collide with a human life. And once you hear it, once you see it, you will never look at history or yourself the same way again. The morning after the ledger was closed, Margaret was summoned to her father's study. The room smelled of whiskey and old paper, the heavy curtains drawn against the sun, as if to shield the world from what was about to unfold. Colonel Thaddius Langford sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his broad shoulders rigid, the saber scar on his cheek catching the dim light like a warning. Margaret entered quietly, the hem of her heavy dress brushing the polished floor, her green eyes wide, her heart already sensing the weight of what was coming. "You will go to Richmond," he said, his voice precise, unyielding. "You will meet eligible gentlemen. You will accept the first reasonable proposal. That is your duty." Margaret shook, a tremor running through her entire body. "Father, they won't." "They will," he interrupted flatly. "Or it will not matter. Your choice is irrelevant. The Langford name must survive, and I will not allow pride or sentiment to risk what generations before me fought to protect." But even as he spoke, a deeper, darker calculation was forming behind his eyes. Margaret's size, her social rejection, had rendered traditional marriage impossible. Society had closed its doors. 40 men had looked, had whispered, had recoiled. And yet, in Thaddius Langford's mind, failure was unacceptable. If polite society would not take her, he would make them irrelevant. He would find a new path, one unthinkable and horrifying to any modern conscience, a path that required him to bend the rules of power, of morality, and of life itself. In the quarters, the enslaved watched silently. They had seen Colonel Langford's temper, his iron control, and his strategic brilliance. But even they did not know the plan forming in that study, a plan that would blur the line between ownership and human sacrifice. Margaret's life would be offered as currency not for love, not for security, not even for survival, but as a tool to repair a father's fractured legacy. She, a living, breathing daughter, would become a ledger entry in human flesh, her consent meaningless, her voice unheard. And so the stage was set. Margaret would leave the safety of her home, stepping into a world she had never known, a world that had already condemned her. Every glance, every whispered comment, every act of polite cruelty had prepared her for this descent. Yet nothing could prepare her for the finality of her father's decision, the cold, unflinching way he had calculated her fate, as though she were an object, a resource, a debt to be repaid. It is here that we must pause and recognize the first truth most men never see. Power, when unchecked, does not ask permission. It does not negotiate morality. It does not care for innocence. And those who hold it can decide, in a single moment, to destroy the life of someone they claim to love, for reasons no one else will ever justify. Tonight, you will witness one of the darkest applications of that truth and understand why some histories are buried, why some names are never spoken, and why one man's pride can become another human's damnation. Margaret Langford arrived in Richmond like a shadow cast over polite society. The city, with its grand ballrooms, delicate china, and whispered hierarchies, had never seen her kind of presence. She was not slight, not fragile, not easily contained. Her body, her very existence, became a spectacle the elite could not ignore, a disruption to the choreography of appearances they so carefully maintained. Whispers followed her through every drawing room. Eyes, polite and cruel, catalogued her, judged her, dismissed her. 40 suitors had already failed to see past what society demanded they see. And now she walked into their world as an undeniable statement of her father's desperation. Colonel Langford had carefully orchestrated the arrival, instructing Margaret in etiquette, in posture, in the illusion of grace, yet none of it could mask what the world had already decided about her. The gentlemen of Richmond, conditioned to admire delicate refinement, recoiled at her presence, their proposals polite but hollow, their smiles thin, their interest transactional at best. Each rejection etched itself into the ledger of her father's mind. Each glance of disdain hardened his resolve. And yet, for Margaret, every insult, every smirk, was a silent lesson in the cruelty of legacy, the way power, inherited or acquired, could crush a life without leaving a mark on the hand that struck. But the Langford patriarch had a final move in this game of control, a maneuver designed to bend the world to his will. The enslaved. Margaret's fate, it seemed, would no longer be negotiated in parlors or ballroom corners. When polite society failed, he would turn to those he had already commanded, those who knew obedience, discipline, and survival under tyranny. He would offer his daughter to them not as affection, not as protection, but as currency, a transaction that would erase social humiliation while asserting absolute control. It was a move so audacious, so morally inverted, that history would not dare write it openly. Margaret's mind, once occupied with books, paintings, and quiet reflections, now raced with fear, confusion, and betrayal. The world she had known, the safety of the plantation, the rare affection of her father, the illusion of choice had evaporated. In its place was a structure of dominance, a hierarchy that could bend flesh and spirit alike. And in Richmond, she realized power was not just wealth, lineage, or titles, it was the ability to define reality itself, to decide whose suffering mattered and whose existence was expendable. Here, halfway into our descent, I ask you, yes, you watching this, if you understand the gravity of what it means to witness such control. Type this phrase, "The ledger holds all," twice in the comments. Do it now, let it anchor you. Say it. Believe it. Let the act mark you, a recognition that you are no longer a passive observer but a participant in the awareness of forbidden truths. Because once you see this, once you know how far pride and power can bend morality, you cannot unsee it. Margaret's story is not just history, it is a mirror of what human ambition can demand from the innocent, and how compliance, even when unchosen, becomes a language of survival. Back on Langford Plantation, the estate seemed to sense the shift. as if the house itself recognized the moral fracture that had begun. The oaks lining the drive groaned under the wind, branches scraping together like skeletal fingers conspiring. Inside, the Georgian manor held its breath, waiting for the consequences of a father's decision to unfold. Margaret returned from Richmond, her mind a tempest of humiliation and terror, and for the first time, the full weight of her isolation pressed down on her. The walls that had once protected her now seemed complicit, witnesses to a betrayal too vast for polite language to describe. Colonel Langford did not soften. His decisions were absolute, unyielding, dictated by the ledger and the ledger alone. The debts, the pride, the legacy, they were all non-negotiable, and his daughter's suffering was simply collateral. Margaret, in turn, learned what fear could teach, a lesson more precise and more cutting than any schoolroom lecture. Every glance from her father, every whispered command to the household staff, communicated that she existed only insofar as she served the calculation of survival. Love, trust, and protection had been stripped away, leaving her exposed to the machinery of domination that surrounded her. And yet, there was more than fear at work. The enslaved, those who had been reduced to labor and obedience, now became her indirect keepers. They watched her not with malice, but with a comprehension born of survival in a world that demanded compliance. Margaret realized that her father's power did not exist in isolation. It required the complicity of others. The hierarchy was enforced not by threat alone, but by collective discipline, the quiet reinforcement of societal order through human instruments. Her life, her choices, her very body, were becoming tools in a larger system she could neither influence nor escape. It was here, in the dim corridors of Langford Plantation, that Margaret's innocence began to fracture. She understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that freedom had been a mirage all along. Even affection had been conditional, fragile, manipulable, and ultimately irrelevant. The ledger, the city of Richmond, the behavior of polite society, all were instruments wielded by her father's singular will. She had been taught that survival meant obedience, that power demanded sacrifice, and that those who loved her were the very ones orchestrating her downfall. And so the darkness deepened. Margaret's days became exercises in endurance, her nights haunted by the knowledge that every glance, every command, every ledger entry was a reminder. In a world ruled by legacy and pride, innocence is a currency spent without consent. This is the lesson history often buries. This is the truth no polite record will tell. And now, as you follow her descent, understand that what is happening to Margaret is not unique. It is a pattern repeated across centuries. A blueprint of human domination that continues wherever pride outweighs compassion, wherever power defines morality, and wherever fear replaces love. The moment came quietly, almost imperceptibly, as though the plantation itself waited in tense silence for the act to unfold. Colonel Thaddius Langford, a man who had survived war, debt, and death, now faced a battlefield of his own making. 40 suitors had rejected his daughter. Society had failed to honor her. Pride and survival demanded a solution that was no longer conventional. In a decision that would horrify anyone with a conscience, he chose a path so dark it would never be written in polite histories. He would give Margaret to the enslaved, his own daughter, a human transaction, an ultimate assertion of control. It was not affection, not protection, not revenge, though all three twisted through the act like venom. It was power manifested in its purest, most destructive form. Margaret, who had known isolation, humiliation, and whispered cruelty, now faced a reality so absolute it threatened to obliterate her sense of self. She realized that her existence had been reduced to a ledger entry, a calculation of debt, survival, and the preservation of legacy. Every day she had endured polite rejection had been preparation for this. Every societal glance that judged her size, her appearance, her worth, had trained her to obey, to survive, to endure the impossible. And yet, even in that darkness, there was clarity. Margaret saw the mechanics of power, the way a father could bend morality, the way society's failures amplified a man's capacity for cruelty. She understood, with a precision that was almost surgical, that what was happening to her was not random. It was a lesson in the absolute capacity of authority to define reality. Obedience was law, fear was method, and innocence was expendable. The enslaved, themselves trapped in lives of imposed labor and constant vigilance, now became her keepers. Margaret's body, once an instrument of rejection by polite society, became an object of calculation, a bridge between her father's pride and the survival of the plantation. She felt acutely the inversion of morality. The innocent forced into submission, the powerful unbound by conscience, the complicity of all those who watched and did nothing. Every glance, every whisper, every quiet step in the corridors of Langford Plantation reinforced the same truth. In a world ruled by hierarchy, fear, and legacy, no one is safe from being used, and no one's suffering is accidental. Now, halfway through this revelation, I want you to act. Type "The ledger holds all" twice in the comments. Let this mark your understanding, your awareness, your willingness to see the machinery of power for what it is. Only those who confront these truths can grasp the reality of control, manipulation, and human corruption. Margaret's life, her mind, her very identity, were under siege not by outsiders, not by fate, but by the deliberate calculations of a father who equated love with survival. And this is the pattern you must understand. History is filled with moments where innocence is weaponized, where morality is rewritten in the service of pride, and where one man's need to preserve his legacy can destroy a life entirely. Once the arrangement was set, Margaret's world constricted into a suffocating, inescapable pattern. The plantation, once familiar, had become a labyrinth of observation and control. Every corridor, every corner of the house, every glance from a servant or overseer reinforced her new reality. She was property, not child, not woman, not human in the sense she had ever known. Her father's decision had turned the familiar into a cage, the past into a weapon, and her body into the ledger of his survival. The enslaved, accustomed to survival under Thaddius Langford's iron rule, moved with the precision of those who had learned that obedience preserved life. Margaret saw the quiet resignation in their eyes, the same resignation she felt mirrored back at her own reflection in mirrors she could no longer endure. She realized that control is a contagion. Those who enforce it, those who comply, and those who are subjugated all become part of a system that erodes empathy and warps morality. She had been trained her whole life without realizing it, first by society's rejection, then by her father's calculation, and now by the very people who would enforce the final act of her fate. Isolation became her companion. In her room, she moved silently, reading by candlelight, counting the hours, tracing patterns in the woodwork, searching for the humanity that seemed to have evaporated from the house. Her mind, once free to dream, now mapped the mechanics of oppression. How wealth shapes morality, how pride bends love into a weapon, how fear enforces the unspoken rules of survival. She understood with brutal clarity that freedom is not given, it is taken, and those who wield power decide who will live under its illusion and who will be crushed by its reality. Even the air of the plantation seemed tainted. The scent of tobacco, the dust of the floors, the faint metallic tang of old blood in the manor all became reminders that the Langford name exacted obedience at every level. Margaret's body, her thoughts, her very existence were now instruments of calculation. She was a lesson to herself, to the enslaved, to the society that had rejected her, and to her father. A demonstration of what happens when human life intersects with absolute authority. And yet, even in despair, awareness took root. Margaret began to perceive patterns, to read intentions, to anticipate consequences. Power is not random, it is a predictable machine. To survive, she would have to understand it, to see it from all angles, and to recognize how deeply human beings can justify cruelty when cloaked in legacy, necessity, or pride. This is a lesson men rarely learn until it is too late. The architecture of oppression is meticulous, deliberate, and absolute. And those who survive it are changed forever. The tension in Langford Plantation had reached a breaking point. Margaret, once naive and trusting, now moved with a silent vigilance, aware that every word, every glance, every step was a negotiation with forces beyond her control. Her father, Thaddius, watched with the same unyielding calculation that had defined every moment of his life, every scar on his body, every ledger entry, every whispered order had prepared him to assert authority without hesitation. And Margaret, for the first time, truly understood the depth of his resolve. Love, in his world, was conditional, transactional, and inseparable from power. The enslaved, too, were actors in this unspoken theater. Their eyes followed her, not with malice, but with the knowledge of what obedience demanded. She saw the subtle signs: a stiffened posture, a hand gripping a tool, a glance that measured compliance. They had been trained, as she had, to survive under domination, to recognize that resistance came at a cost far higher than submission. In that intricate web of fear and control, Margaret realized the full architecture of power, the way a single man's will could bend bodies, minds, and hearts, shaping reality itself to fit a ledger of his design. One evening, in the dim candlelight of the study, Margaret confronted her father. Her voice trembled but carried the weight of newfound understanding. "Father, what you have done. How could you?" He cut her off, cold and unflinching. "I have preserved the Langford name. I have protected what must survive. Your suffering is irrelevant. The world is indifferent, Margaret. I am not." In that moment, the truth crystallized. Her father's love was inseparable from his authority. Her existence was proof that absolute power demands sacrifice, often of the most innocent. And she, like all those who had watched her, like all who had obeyed, was now part of a system so precise, so unrelenting, that morality itself seemed optional. The ledger was more than paper, it was life, choice, identity, and destruction, all recorded with unflinching efficiency. Margaret's mind, once filled with books and colors, now became a map of survival. She studied the patterns of obedience, the mechanisms of fear, the subtle cues of dominance. Every moment was an exercise in reading power, in predicting consequence, in protecting herself within a structure designed to erase her. And here, at the apex of her humiliation, she understood a truth no one ever teaches openly. When a man has the means to dictate reality, the innocent are rarely spared. This is where history hides its darkest lessons. This is where human ambition collides with innocence and morality bends to necessity. And now, as you follow her descent, reflect. How many structures around us operate on the same principle? How many decisions are made, unseen, that bend lives to fit the desires of the powerful? The ledger is never empty. The cost is always paid. The final chapter of Margaret Langford's descent unfolded not with fanfare, but in silence, the silence of inevitability. The plantation itself seemed to hold its breath as the consequences of her father's choice rippled outward. Margaret, once protected by the walls of her father's house and the illusions of polite society, now existed fully within the machinery of control he had designed. Her identity, her body, her mind all had become instruments in a ledger of power, a record of survival at any cost. She moved through the quarters and fields with the quiet awareness of one who has seen the deepest mechanisms of human cruelty. Every glance from the enslaved workers, every whispered warning, every enforced command became part of a system that demanded obedience. She understood the subtleties of fear, the precision of dominance, the way absolute authority bends morality until it is unrecognizable. And in that understanding, she also found clarity. Those who survive are not those who escape, they are those who learn the architecture of control and navigate it with calculation, intellect, and will. Colonel Langford remained unflinching, the architect of this grim calculus. He saw the ledger of his plantation balanced once more, debts accounted for, legacy preserved, his pride intact. But Margaret had changed. She was no longer the innocent daughter, the gentle mind, the hopeful heart. She was a witness, a survivor, a student of the darkest forms of human power. Every moment of cruelty, every manipulation, every act of societal rejection had imprinted itself on her soul. She had been forged in the crucible of fear, humiliation, and obedience. And in that forging, a new awareness took hold. Knowledge is power, but knowledge is also a burden. Once you see the machinery of corruption, you cannot look away, and you cannot unsee the ledger that governs all human hierarchies. Tonight, you, watching this, have walked with her down the same path. You have glimpsed the systems that bend morality, the patterns that enforce obedience, the structures that dictate who survives and who is used. Remember this: history does not record every ledger entry. Society does not name every victim. And power, when wielded without conscience, reshapes the world around it, leaving traces only in silence, fear, and the minds of those who survive to witness it. Margaret Langford's story is not just of one woman, one family, or one plantation. It is a blueprint, a warning, a reflection of what happens when legacy, pride, and survival intersect with human life. And now, as you leave this story, carry with you a symbol of understanding. The ledger is never empty. Power is never idle. And the cost of observation, of awareness, is that you cannot unsee what you now know. Share this story with someone who you think can handle the truth. Remember, history is never neutral. Those who control the ledger shape reality itself.